Manu Prakash is recognized as a bioengineering genius by the MacArthur Foundation. He's the leader of the Frugal Lab at Stanford. His lab develops experiments to understand how computation is embodied in biological matter. They are dedicated towards inventing, building, and scaling up frugal science tools to democratize access to science, inventing a 50-cent microscope, for example. Please welcome to our stage, Manu Prakash. Have fun. Oh, shucks. How about that?
So I'm here to tell you about a phrase that I love talking about, frugal science. It's going to be about cost. You know, growing up, I was told that the world was divided in developed and developing countries. And the more that I see it, I've started realizing that that framework doesn't really apply. The world is divided in haves and have-nots. I know many of you care about cost because that means products will or will not reach a given set of a community that you might care about. I've been thinking about this in the context of being able to really cause extreme shift in cost for products. Randy likes to call this trying to make something out of nothing, and I will tell you a few things we have created in that space. I teach this class over the last almost a decade now, and there is just one thing I want you to remember from my talk, is a saying that one of my students from Sudan taught me. He said, Manu, what you're really teaching is something that we have in Sudanese, and it translates to the pen that does not eradicate ignorance and shame. The pen is a symbol of technology, and effectively, as technologists and people that strongly believe that technology can have social impact and change, we have to embody that to create sets of technologies that would eradicate ignorance and shame. I'm going to give you 3 examples today in my own work, all the way from global health into villages in Senegal, to ecological monitoring in the Arctic, to also science education programs that we run, trying to bring these tools to people. Now, to give you a context of this, let's first take you out to a field site. So at this moment, you are in a site in rural India called Kalahandi. This is a malaria clinic. It's a one-room clinic. They would roughly get between 200 to 300 patients per year. Many of the kids that would walk to this clinic have falciparum, which is essentially a death sentence if not treated within the next 5 to 6 days. 5 to 6 days, while to even arrive at a health center like this would take you between 12 to 24 hours for most of the sites. That's Prem and Durga. They spend 10 to 11 hours in a lab, and it's very rare to even have a lab like this essentially working, and they are literally trying to diagnose what kid should get what drug. They are making life-saving decisions and do this day in and day out. The second place that I want to take you, this is now in the summer in the Arctic. We were out there last year trying to map and measure the changes that are happening. And you might firstly see that, oh, there doesn't seem to be anything common between these sets of problems. But by the end of this talk, I want to convince you that they are deeply connected. This is the fastest warming place on our planet. Effectively, the ecosystems that we have will not be there in my lifetime. Many of the scientists currently believe that we really cannot reverse much of what's happening and has happened in the Arctic. And then the third place I want to take you is just any regular classroom. If you were to close your eye and imagine a classroom, I don't know whether you will imagine the picture that you see there, which is a photograph I took in Ghana. Effectively, 1 billion kids around the world, out of 2 billion total kids, live in families that you would think about is less than $2.5 per day. And when you start asking yourself, what are the tools of creativity that we are providing these kids, I would say we're providing them very little. And that is half of the talent pool to think about in terms of all the sets of problems that we are leaving behind. Roughly 500 million kids had absolutely no access to any kind of online education. This is what that looked like for most of the kids. So, you know, this is kind of a depressing story. I lose sleep at night every day with all the positivity and everything, and I want you to lose some sleep too. It is very important to be thinking about these sets of issues, and the fact that the race and the advances in technology are not reaching majority of the people. I was one of those kids. I grew up in India. That's the youngest and probably the only photograph I have of my childhood. And one of the things that I do remember growing up in India was realizing, how do you build out of nothing? I remember taking this exam in around close to high school, where you're supposed to draw a microscope, but I had never seen one. And you had to draw it exactly the angle that it was in the book. And one of the things that I kind of almost find laughable now, that with all the books and all the internet, you can provide a lot of knowledge to people. You really can't provide experience. And that's what you need to really be able to build your own role and your own, you can see yourself as a scientist itself. So out of all this crisis, sometimes it can be a state where you feel nothing can be done. And I want to tell you that that's not the case. I don't know how many of you know the story of how bicycles were invented. Essentially, 1815, there was an eruption in Europe that led to a massive famine, and most of the horses died. And Baron Karl von Drais came up with this notion that he's going to have these two wheels rolling around. Remember, this is 1815. And it's remarkable that as a technology that came out, I mean, of course, the famine went away, the horses came back, but the bicycle still remained. There's roughly around 1 billion bicycles on this planet today. And often enough, when I think about technology, it's the pencils and the bicycles of the world that I'm interested in. So let me give you a few examples of nothing as good as a bicycle, but in that direction, tools and technologies that we have created. In being able to diagnose any disease under a tree, to be able to build a citizens' movement of monitoring, ecological monitoring in a changing climate. And probably the most important piece of my work is to give kids a chance to magnify their own curiosity. And much of this has to be done as a global first approach. You really have to think about a planet as a whole. There is no point just trying to hold in an infectious disease that spreads so rapidly in one place and not worry about the rest of the world. So it's really important to be thinking about this as planetary scale technologies. And in the past, we have enabled and taken on planetary scale challenges with citizens on the front line. I don't know how many of you were kids and young kids when Operation Moonwatch was going on. When the Smithsonian distributed telescopes around the world, primarily because the Sputnik had been launched, we had no technology at that moment to monitor satellites in space. And that led to the largest citizen science program of that time. Almost for the 60 years in a row, much of that data was actually collected by average citizens. And right there in the middle, you can see United States, Mrs. Lloyd Eisenhower, housewife volunteer, sought Sputnik 2. And actually, many of the launches of Sputnik later on that happened through this citizens program, far ahead of much of the military complex when they were trying to build satellite trackers. So you might ask, what is the current largest citizen science program? That program got shut down, but that's actually our community health workers. And many of the tools that you see here that I work on creating are all focused on what can fit in the backpack of one of these very brave community health workers that you see out there. I mean, much of the reason that we had any control on Ebola was primarily because these community health workers with very little were willing to go household to household, knowing fully well that you would actually get exposed. And that is the harsh reality of the world even today. Over the last decade, we have created roughly of the order of 24 tools. I don't have the time to talk about all of them. They frame in either in the context of global health, in the context of ecological monitoring, and of course in education. And I'll just give you a flavor of 2 or 3 of them to sort of whet your appetite. So let's start with diagnostics under a tree. I was a young faculty almost 10 years ago. I was in Uganda, and this remarkable gentleman reached out when I was running trainings for pathologists on microscopy, and he said, "Manu, you should come back when you can do diagnosis under a tree." At that time, I didn't understand much of what he was saying, but he was really talking about pandemics and the fact that most of our diagnostics technology do not scale to the rapid fire increase in infectious diseases that we actually see. I took that to heart, and even till today, when I think about even post the COVID era, 47% of the world population actually has no access to appropriate diagnostics. That's half the world. How are we supposed to believe that what just happened is not going to happen unless we don't even have the tools for half the world to be able to have any basic diagnostics? I'm not talking about non-communicable diseases. These are curable diseases that 1 or 2 pills could actually save. Things that we thought that we almost cured years ago. And to just put this in perspective, this is a photograph from one of the villages I work in. This is a mother. She's pregnant. You can see the children, but you can actually also see that the kids are playing on the graveyard of their brothers and sisters. This is a very common thing that's done primarily because you don't want to forget the kids that you've lost. We still lose 600,000 kids just for malaria alone. What does it look like to diagnose malaria in the field? This is ASHA workers on the right in India and one of our clinical sites at the border of Mali and Senegal in Kédougou on the left. And effectively, you get hundreds of patients coming in, and the sets of tools that we have are fairly rudimentary. Malaria at this point, the parasite has evaded one of the common diagnostic tools, the RDTs that are used with a gene deletion. And at that same time, we also are seeing resistance for the common drug that we use. And thirdly, we have for the first time in Africa a malaria vector that is an urban mosquito. I know many of you in Florida are very well aware of the challenges with mosquitoes. This would be the very first time there is worry that we would have urban malaria, not just rural malaria. So we've been working on these sets of tools, and we asked ourselves a question inspired by the manufacturing of how ballpoint pens are made. During the time of COVID, we developed, and it's funny that the moment I said a ballpoint pen fell out of somewhere. I don't know how that just happened. We started asking, could you do molecular diagnostics in the middle of nowhere? And with some sets of support at Stanford, many sets of Gates Foundation, we developed a test that is as easy as if you were making a cup of tea. It requires no electricity and is programmable. We can program it for different sets of primers. It took a while to build this. There's a lot of engineering that went in that I'm not going to talk about. But we were able to, with all the support, go from my kitchen, where I was conceiving the idea with the sets of parts that I found on a Home Depot, all the way to actually running a clinical validation study for this, to be able to show that everyday people, when trained, can actually run molecular tests. And the vision that we have for this is not just this being the product, because I said that this has to reach every corner of the world for these sets of things to make a difference. We are thinking of the manufacturing platform as the product. And one of the things that we are building right now is in 2 container ships, an entire manufacturing pipeline for diagnostics. All the enzymes, all the biologics, the gadgetry, everything put in. We have our first field partner in Senegal, but one of the goals is to really show that you can do distributed manufacturing of programmable diagnostics. You know, I mentioned a lot of things about malaria. I'm not going to have too much time to tell you about the technical aspects, but you saw incredible things AI can do. For the very first time now, we've built an instrument that can do malaria diagnostics in completely real time. So what you're watching on the screen is a finger prick blood from a patient being scanned. This is driven by essentially a cell phone charger. And in real time, it's identifying individual parasites. So what you saw Durga and Prem doing in the clinic, now we can do in an autonomous manner. Durga and Prem, in 30 to 45 minutes, can see between 3,000 to 5,000 cells, red blood cells. In a single finger prick, there is roughly around 20 million cells, and the machine is able to really read out a massive number of them to get very high fidelity diagnostics out in the field. I'm very excited about these sets of tools because they tell a different narrative of AI. And the fact that these tools are programmable, we can program this for sickle cell anemia, we can program this for TB, we can program this for sexually transmitted diseases, to really be able to give these sets of tools to the frontline workers that we care about. I just returned from Liberia, and one of the things that we are starting to realize is the power of what does it mean to interact and interface with frontline workers, both the power that they have, the passion that they have, only if they are given the right set of tools. In the few 5 minutes that I have, I want to take you now a little bit back to the ocean and tell you why these two problems are connected. You know, one of the things that I said in the first phase was this idea of planetary scale measurements. This notion that we need to measure viruses and pathogens in human populations and animals in our sets of communities globally, the same actually applies for measurements to be able to be made out in the ocean. Every single parameter in the context of climate that you think about and the kinds of models that we make, we don't have enough microbial data to truly understand where does much of that come from. Very simply, oceans sequester so much carbon, but we don't have any metric of where to put the biological pump, which is the primary mechanism for this carbon sequestration. Much of the time when I go out to sea, it costs me $50,000 to $60,000 per day on one of my expeditions. Most of these expeditions last 45 days or more. You can see an astronomical, and I'm really proud of the fact that as taxpayers, we're able to support programs like this, but it's not enough. We will not be able to measure the pulse of the planet with that kind of an approach. So we flip the table around and we ask, who else is out there at sea? How many of you sail here? I'm curious, a few of you. There is, at this very moment, between 10 to 15,000 sailors at sea, open waters, out there exploring the oceans. This happens to be one of our volunteers. He does sail with a chicken, and yes, the chicken is called, I know you've all seen Moana, but this is for real. This is Gurek. And one of the things we started asking is, could we retrofit these boats with low-cost tools to be able to make biological measurements? That led to, this is Lake Chilika. This is one of the protected sites. This was one of the first machines we built that allows us to now do microbial measurements out at sea in hands of essentially fishing communities. And then the tool that you saw has had its own evolution. I have one of these sets of tools right here. It cost us a couple $100s to make. It's completely open source. And then you start essentially measuring the types of life that you see in aquatic ecosystems. We posted all of the innards of this on the web, and something really remarkable happened. Within 6 months, that project became that. Hundreds of people around the world started building these tools, started posting pictures. I call this the ecograms of the world, not the Instagrams. And much of this now has led to tens of millions of data sets that have now been collected all across the world, and this community is starting to grow. And again, it's a testament to thinking about a citizens first approach to measurement. I'll give you another example since I brought up mosquitoes. Here is one of the graduate students. Just the same problem that I said about the ocean actually applies to mosquitoes. I don't know how many of you know. How many mosquitoes are there in Florida? Does anybody know? It's just a lot is all we got. And the reason that that's the answer is because we're still using this technology. This is how Ronald Ross discovered malaria, picking up mosquitoes a tweezer at a time, looking under a microscope to identify what species. We asked how to flip the script in Frugal Science on that, and I'm going to play this musical score. It's not as lovely as what you just heard, but I still want you to hear it. Do you all know what you're hearing? This is an orchestra of the 40 most deadliest mosquitoes on the planet. We went around the world, we collected these acoustics, and the reason I'm playing this is you can tell the notes apart. Using machine learning, we were able to build a cell phone detector that can essentially now detect species just from a buzz of a mosquito. Half a second of a buzz that's needed. And then again, going back to where does this tool belong? We've been training folks across the world. This is a village in Madagascar that we work in, where the kids are buzzing around, and of course, they are the ones that are going and mapping what's happening in their villages. I'm going to end this talk by something that I find the most important, which is thinking about the young kids. Because to me, what matters most is not what I would create, but what I leave behind in the context of them thinking about the world that we're giving them. And that really all begins with curiosity. So we saw all these stars out in the galaxy, and you might wonder that everything to explore is out there, far away. But in fact, there are more microbial species here than the stars in our galaxy. And maybe 99% of all of that life is actually still undescribed. Almost 10 years ago, we built a tool literally using a flat sheet of paper to put together a microscope. I was excited about the idea of democratizing microscopy. We put a price point on it, that for a price point of $1, anybody in the world should be able to see a bacteria. We actually did that. This is the footage that's from one of the microscopes. It doesn't require any batteries, any cell phones. If you have a cell phone, you can collect data on it. We published the paper as an academic group. I was quite proud when Bill Gates tweeted about it. It was very interesting. He wrote, "An origami microscope, ? Interesting." I was hung up with the question mark. Why did he put a question mark? It's like, I showed it, and what I realized is that maybe in some subversive way he was challenging us. He was challenging that as an academic group we had done that, and at that moment I decided I'll start a program. We said we will ship 100,000 microscopes to any kid in the world. At this point, we have taken that program to now 2 million kids. This is the world's largest microscopy-based program in the world. And one of the power of this is, when you think about your role in all of this, I love these parents. They're not sharing the microscope with their own child. It's very important. Be this parent, because you will realize that they embody what you love. When we share our expression of joy with something, that's really what one of the kids pick up. At this point, it's one of the largest sets of programs, 150 countries around the world. We run massive workshops globally. And again, thinking about in fairly challenging conditions, refugee camps, prisons, libraries, anywhere that you can see, and all the way to higher education. And one of the things that we're very proud of is, I'm already out of time, so I'm just going to end with, we've been building programs with governments. We've been translating all of this work on many sets of languages. There's a lot of academic work that happens on this. These are sets of group associated with plant diseases. You see Garek again exploring the oceans all the way in the Amazon. Many new species have been discovered with these sets of tools. There are many biodiversity programs. So we have a program in Congo essentially looking at diarrheal diseases in gorillas. Mosquito surveillance programs, fisheries. One of the largest programs in Iraq, right after the war, Mohammed, that's in that corner, started the science club in Iraq using foldscopes all across Iraq, essentially starting to build what many of these kids had lost. And I want to end with a personal story of Mo Pandirajan here. He's one of the most prolific foldscope user. After a couple of years of release of foldscope, he crossed me in terms of the documentation. This one single individual, 4 years of work, engaging with the community, has trained more than 95,000 kids across the country. One single individual. So when you remember and think about this, after English, Tamil is the most spoken language on our platform associated with this. He sent me this number and I didn't believe it. And when you don't believe somebody, you go on social media. So I went on social media. This is just last week. Him exploring and sharing what he does. And again, much of this work is about empowering others to be able to share and bring much of that joy to everyone. Because unless we bring everyone into the fold of what technology can actually do, you would never get solutions that truly solve global problems. I'll end here. I wish we had more time, but one of the things that I'm going to try to do is set up some of these demos. I would love for any of you to actually build and play with the microscopes itself, but I am here for a conversation, so please find me.